This video is going to look at the overall successes and failures of the British economy and the various measures we can use to judge that success and to judge how well Britain turned its peacetime economy into a wartime economy, and how we can decide whether the British economy was something that can be described as effective or successful, or whether there were a lot of outside influences that allowed Britain to maintain a kind of facade of success, even though that was masking a huge number of failures and the kind of inevitability of collapse. In order to do this, we're going to look at two questions that have come up recently. So the first one is, only the Lend-Lease programme prevented the collapse of the British economy. How valid is this view of the impact of the war on the British economy? And the second one, the transition from a peacetime to a wartime economy was slow and uncoordinated. How accurate is this description? So both of those questions are asking something about success in terms of the British economy. The first one is saying, well, how successful was the British economy by itself? And did it need this significant outside influence, these outside measures to come in and prevent it from collapsing? And the second question is asking, how effectively did Britain alter its economy to put it onto a war footing, to change it from a peacetime economy that focused on kind of consumer goods and exports to a wartime economy that focused on total war and war production. First thing to think about is the kind of context of the early war. So one of the things that I think is really important and is emphasised by some historians is that there's something that Churchill says right at the beginning of his premiership that really kind of flows through this whole question. And he says, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat, and goes on to say, you ask what is our aim, I answer in one word, victory, victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory however long and hard the road may be. And some historians, such as Corelli Barnett, who we'll come on to talk about a bit more later, have pointed out that this actually turned out to be true. The victory was at all costs, and the cost was Britain's financial and economic power and independence. Britain, by committing totally to the war, sold her economy. That by the end of the war there was very little left. And Barnett goes on to explain this by saying, so far as the British government knew in August 1940, as they poured out their gold and dollars, the beginning of 1941 would present them with the unimaginable catastrophe of being unable to keep the nation in food and work, let alone wage war even in the most limited fashion. Basically, he's saying that the government had run out of money, and it was clear to most people in the government that they wouldn't be able to buy anything from abroad or pay their workers when the beginning of 1941 came. And some of the evidence for this comes from the Destroyers for Bases agreement, where the USA gives Britain 50 World War I era destroyers in return for British bases in Newfoundland and the Caribbean. Now, this agreement was hugely beneficial to the USA. Lord Beaverbrook, who was in the British government, called it an unfair bargain, but Britain was in such dire need they had to accept they needed these destroyers in order to protect the convoys going across the Atlantic, and they couldn't afford to buy or build them themselves. In fact, the War Cabinet itself has suggested, prior to this agreement being introduced at the start of September, that from our point of view, the facilities we were offering were worth far more than the 50 old destroyers and other material which we were to receive. But the fact that they were forced to accept this deal demonstrates that Britain was in an extremely weak economic position at the start of the war, and it can be argued that Britain had basically collapsed economically by late 1940 and was only sustained by the loans that came later. So there's a kind of situation in 1940 where it looks like Britain isn't going to be able to afford to continue to fight against Germany, and that is obviously going to be catastrophic. They weren't going to lose in the battlefield, they were going to lose in the balance sheet. However, that obviously turned out not to be the case, and for some people, the reason that wasn't the case is Lend-Lease. So the Lend-Lease plan was created in March 1941, which is important because it's 9 months before the USA entered the war, but America is basically agreeing to fund Britain and get her to do the fighting for her. And a lot of people, most people would agree that Roosevelt did this because he knew without significant loans Britain would not be able to continue the war. The Act is officially called an Act to Promote the Defence of the United States, which again some historians have argued was a very good name because it greatly benefited American industry. Britain's needs for total war provided an almost limitless market for American manufactured goods, and this limitless market created huge economic growth in the USA. And remember that in the early 1940s, America is still suffering the after effects of the Great Depression. Significant recovery has taken place, but there is still more to be done. And so having an unlimited market for your goods is obviously a chance for businesses throughout America to thrive. So over the course of the war, Lend-Lease allowed Britain to borrow £5.5 billion, which I think in current money is around about 300 billion, and provided 17% of our munitions and also provided a significant amount of food. Now, Corelli-Barnett again. It was clearly to America's advantage that American weapons should be carried into battle by the fighting men of England and the Empire rather than by the sons of American mothers. Now, Corelli-Barnett is a very right-wing historian in terms of the economic view. He is very critical of Britain's economy during the war and very critical of the subservience that Britain ended up in relation to America. He thinks that Britain should have done more to alter and reform their own economy and should have been less focused on building up American debt. One of the big problems with Lend-Lease was that Britain couldn't export any goods which contained any Lend-Lease material or any other goods similar to those which they'd received from the Americans. So in many ways it significantly damaged the British economy. So they couldn't import locomotives from America and then sell locomotives to Argentina. And they couldn't import, steel from America and then use that steel to build something which would then sell abroad. So it caused significant issues for Britain. With Lend-Lease, that meant that the British economy was massively focused, entirely geared towards producing more material and didn't focus on exports. So by 1944, exports were down to 31% of the 1938 level, and it was almost impossible for Britain to revive those imports in the post-war period thanks to the terms of Lend-Lease and the fact that mainly the Americans had established these new markets, and so this caused Britain huge problems. Another big issue was that Lend-Lease ended after the defeat of Japan, and this initially caused Britain significant issues. John Maynard Keynes, who's the very famous economist who speaks a lot on this, called it a financial Dunkirk, compares it to the huge problems that Britain had faced at Dunkirk. However, some discounts and loans were agreed, so Britain was able to go on, but again, this kind of provides more evidence for the fact that Lend-Lease was essential to the British economy. If it hadn't been for Lend-Lease and the loans of the Americans, Britain would really have struggled. Now on to some kind of counter arguments, and one of the big counter arguments comes from the situation of Canada. Canada produces 800,000 trucks during the war, and trucks are an unbelievably important part of World War II because of its mobile nature. Having trucks to be able to move things about is essential. The Canadians also produced a huge amount of metals, 50% of allied aluminium, which is obviously important in aircraft because it's light and durable, and nickel, which is used to prevent metals from rusting. And Canadian companies also were important in terms of helping build the atomic bombs. So the Canadian economy is very important. But what's very important when it comes to the relationship with Britain is that the Canadians gave Britain £1 billion or 4 billion Canadian dollars, which was the second largest amount that any country gave, and on a per capita basis is the highest. And this has been called the $1 billion gift, and caused a lot of problems in Canada, but does massively benefit the British. And another very important thing the Canadians did is provided aid in other ways. For example, they trained a lot of pilots, and around half of the air crews that flew in the RAF were trained in Canada. The Canadians also provided convoy protection for shipping crossing the Atlantic, and also a lot of raw materials for the British. So, well, Lend-Lease is obviously very important. You can also say that, well, actually the Canadians provided a lot of aid too, and this maybe balanced out some of that. As well as Lend-Lease being important, the British government introduced a lot of measures itself in order to help fund the war. The first one is the significant increase in income tax. So this is a kind of introduction of a Keynesian policy where the government directly intervenes, and it's a rejection of the kind of laissez-faire attitude that Chamberlain had, where the government didn't want to directly intervene in the economy and wanted kind of people to be left to themselves. And this involved low taxes and low intervention. Now the government is committing to high taxes and keen intervention. There's also massive policies introduced to force people to save money, and if they're saving money and also not spending it, then this keeps inflation in check. So basically people are very limited in what they can spend their money on, and if you're limited in what you're spending your money on, that keeps demand low, and if demand is low, then inflation doesn't go up. And that is very important, because you don't want inflation to go up, because inflation starts to go up significantly, then it destabilizes the economy. So keeping inflation in check was very important, and the British government managed that very successfully. The Board of Trade, which was kind of in charge of various parts of the economy, keeps civilian goods output low. So by the end of the war, it's half of the situation at the start. So there's a lot of shortages in things such as furniture, clothes, the kind of consumer goods that people like are in very short supply. So this is a bad thing because people want them, but it's a good thing because it means the economy is focused on other things. So it tells us that the British had managed to get the economy to focus on what you would call the right areas, the areas that were producing stuff for the war effort. Imports are massively controlled as well. Imports reduced by 40% during the war. Again, this means that focus can be on war production and away from consumer goods. So in order to kind of sum this up, these policies are targeted at preventing inflation and providing funds for the government. And they are successful to some extent, as there wasn't a massive inflationary crisis during the war and the government didn't go bankrupt. So this is the kind of counterbalance to the argument that Lend-Lease was essential. You can say, well, actually, the wartime economic policies were essential because they contributed a huge amount. And these policies are also ones that were introduced quite quickly and quite stringently, and so you can use that as an argument that actually no, the government didn't introduce policies slowly and in an uncoordinated way, it focused them. The other big area with a kind of economic issue was food, and rationing starts in January 1940. First, it's limited to bacon, butter and sugar. By 42, this is increased to meat, tea, jam, biscuits, breakfast cereals, cheese, eggs, fat, milk, canned and dried fruit. And Chamberlain, one of the successes is that he creates a Minister of Food to make sure that this goes well. Rationing is introduced for a few reasons. First of all, it's to make sure that everyone has enough food and make sure that everyone gets a fair share of food so that they can carry on working. But it's also to prevent queuing. And you'd think, oh, that's not that unimportant thing, but actually, if you've got that the butcher, the fishmonger, the general store is only going to have food in certain days, you're going to spend a long time queuing. But if you know that you can turn up basically whenever and you'll get your share because they're not going to run out because everyone is entitled to their share, then you don't have to queue. So instead of spending hours and hours and hours queuing, which would make people angry and also would be a waste of time, you don't have to do that. So this is another efficiency measure and it's a very clever idea. Alcohol and cigarettes aren't rationed, but they're taxed exceptionally highly. It's very, very expensive to buy alcohol and cigarettes. And so this money, the money from alcohol and cigarettes, was used to subsidise, which is another way of saying lower the price. So the government kind of contributes towards the price of certain foods, particularly bread, milk, meat and potatoes, to make sure that the working classes were able to afford good quality food. Most people would agree that rationing was a fair policy, and so it was accepted. It seemed to work reasonably well. However, there was a large black market in food, and so the rich were able to get around the restrictions, but people that broke these restrictions were very, very harshly targeted with long prison sentences because the government were given very, very, very significant powers to kind of crack down on this, much in the same way that the government has been given significant powers to crack down on people that break lockdown in the pandemic. That it was £10,000 fines and 10-year sentences and all those kind of things to make sure, or to try and prevent it from happening, in order to deter people, because they think that if they try and break these laws, then they'll end up significantly punished. So that's the same sort of idea. It's also the introduction of British restaurants, and British restaurants, something we'll come on to talk about a bit more when we do the War and Society bit, but they were kind of council-run communal kitchens where people could turn up and get a cheap meal. It was originally intended to help people who'd been bombed out, so people that had lost their houses and so couldn't cook their own food, but they spread throughout the country due to their popularity. They were cheap meals and involved 3 courses, and it just gave people a chance to sit down together and eat together. And that's a very important way of building up a community spirit. This is a very successful thing, but again, we will talk more about that during the War and Society thing. So rationing is a very, very good measure that allows the government to provide for the entirety of the British population and prevented any kind of significant inequality. So it's effective, it's coordinated, and it's successful. So how do we kind of sum these points up? So if you're looking at these 2 questions, they're both asking you to make a judgment about the success of the British economy. One asks if Lend-Lease was essential, and one asks if measures were introduced quickly and effectively. So your evaluation on those questions must address this directly. Be clear about the need for Lend-Lease. You either say, look, Lend-Lease was needed, without it the economy would have collapsed, or you say, well, actually there are other things that prevented the British economy from collapsing. Or you have to talk about how effectively the measures were introduced, how effective rationing was, how effective the government kind of economic and taxation policies were. You can also use other aspects of the economy topic that we have studied to answer these questions. In particular, for the 2017 question, you'll at least have to make a reference to changes in industry and changes in agriculture, because those changes are changes that significantly alter the kind of nature and basics of the British economy. Historiography for this section is quite varied. This is a question that's kind of split down the left-right sort of polar spectrum in terms of how you answer it. Generally speaking, historians on the left think the British economy was pretty good during the war, and historians on the right think it was pretty rubbish. There is a bit of overlap, but generally, because the economy during the war was a kind of socialist war, communism, the left-wing historians tend to celebrate it, and right-wing historians tend to condemn it. So, but to start off with a look at a good primary source quote, John Maynard Keynes, who was one of the British government economists, said that we threw good housekeeping to the winds, but we saved ourselves and helped save the world. So that's a kind of way that you can conclude an essay about that and say, look, maybe it wasn't particularly coordinated and maybe the government policies weren't that successful, but they did what they had to and they won the war, and so we should maybe not judge them too harshly. On to the historians. Calder and Addison say that the government's fiscal policies, that's tax policies, and that other indirect taxation, meant that while the money the government took in went up, it was never enough to finance the cost of the war. Therefore, Lend-Lease was essential. Robert Mackay agrees, saying that Britain did not have the capital to finance the war. Crowley Barnett is very much in that camp and says that British economy was a rotting Victorian hulk, that it was going to collapse anyway, and that the Lend-Lease programme was essential to stop it collapsing. Mark Donnelly is on the other side, and he says that the workforce played a huge role in improving productivity, that agriculture performed extremely well, and he says that you can look at these massive increases in productivity and that tells you the government did well during the war. Barnett very much disagrees with that and says actually if you compare the British productivity to the German productivity, or particularly to the American productivity, British were much worse. Peter Howlett says that, look, the British economy must have been effective because they won the war, so that tells us that the British economy did survive, and it must have prospered because fighting against Germany was such a difficult task that there has to be some success there. Finally, if I was going to write an essay about this, I would want to talk about a few key things. First of all, you can either have a paragraph about the situation at the start of the war, where you talk about the various situation and the destroyers for bases and Corelli Barnett saying that they're near bankruptcy, or you can kind of blend that into the introduction and to the kind of Lend-Lease paragraph. Then you would need to have a paragraph about Lend-Lease and the extent to which it prevented collapse if you're writing about Lend-Lease. If you're not, if you're writing about the kind of move from a peacetime to a wartime economy, you can blend those two paragraphs together a bit. You'd also want to talk about aid from other countries. Then you want to talk about the measures the government introduced, so tax, inflation and rationing, changes to the workforce, so industry and agriculture. Now, if you're talking about the 2017 question about peacetime to a wartime economy, you can have a paragraph on industry and a paragraph on agriculture. If you are doing the Lend-Lease essay, then you can put the measures the government introduced and the industry and agriculture paragraphs together. So that will kind of give you an idea of hopefully what to do. The economy questions are quite difficult, but there's a lot of things that you can really evaluate effectively. So this is a chance to do some really good analysis and evaluation. And if you have a good understanding of the economy stuff, then you can bring it in loads of different places. You can bring it in preparations for war, you can bring it in Chamberlain, you can bring it in Churchill, you can bring it in the kind of Battle of the Atlantic, you can bring it in loads of different places. So it is very useful to have a good understanding of this.